for today, that's for sure. So, and of course, saying something about this conference is, I can tell you what I heard and what inspired me, but I only attended some of it. So I want to highlight three things that spoke to me as something that I think is worth thinking about, right? So one of the observations I have is the importance of cities, as I heard in many sessions and many conversations, and cities as potential, that have a great potential for shedding some light how we can change, how we can advance social change, because they could be incubators of ideas. The population in cities is much more open to change, to experimentation, it's more heterogeneous, and so on. But also my idea that I had, and I wrote about, I have to change my publications from now on, is seeing cities as definitely more efficient ways of energetically, more efficient way of providing for human needs and wants, is now very much open to question. The picture is much more nuanced. I think cities have a potential in that score as well, but this potential has not been yet reached as far as we know, and there is plenty of interesting research, I think, to be done in that area. The second, and we at SCORE, our partnership with USDN will really continue very fruitfully on those tracks. The second thing that was of interest to me and I found significant is greater attention to consumption-based accounting of carbon footprint and ecological footprint. I mean, the idea is not new. It's been done for quite a while, and countries are increasingly showing how imports and exports change that picture. But what I heard, what I saw here was a much more granular look at that from the perspectives of lifestyle, income, urban infrastructure, and so on. And I think we can learn a great deal about opportunities for change by pursuing that line of research. That was the second thing. And my third moment of inspiration was the conversation about income inequality as not just an issue of fairness, justice, and social policy, but as an issue of consumption. We talked about decadent consumption of the top tier of the population, and I checked on the web while we were sitting in one of those sessions. So we of course know that as income increases, carbon footprint increases. So I looked at the top 1% of income in the US takes 25%, I mean, top 1% takes 25% of income. And I'm estimating, I couldn't quickly find it, that probably top 5% probably accounts for, what shall we say, 35-40% of all income, right? So this is where the consumption is. Even if this is not a linear relationship, and we've been spending a lot of energy and intellectual capital on studying people in the lower strata of income, in the middle strata of income, but this is where we should also look, and I think it's going to be interesting and difficult to do research because the data is much harder. It's much easier to study the poor than to study the rich. We all know that. Yes, but the thought that we could frame the issue of huge consumption as an ecological issue, not the social policy, kind of intrigues me and inspired me to ask a lot of potential research questions. So
thank you, Halina. This is great. This is wonderful. This is very inspirational. And we now move to Vanessa.
I got a real support from somebody here.
Go ahead. What?
Yeah.
Never mind.
So thank you so much, Philip, for inviting me just to say a few words. So I also was kind of struck by a few things. So first of all, it was just great to hear about the University of Maine and just find out a little bit more about what's happening here. And I just kept, every time someone would come up to speak, I'd be like, wow, that's happening here too. This is great. So that was really wonderful, and what a great hosting we had here. And I think that just relates to the fact that I just really enjoyed the community of people. I just find all of you and all the conversations, the fun we have, but also the openness to connect and exchange in ways that really keep advancing all of our different research and our practice, but also just as great colleagues. So that was a big, a fun thing that no matter who I spoke to, I just found it was very, very interesting and very warm and open. So, and then in terms of the field of sustainable consumption, Georgos, your point about that societies are defined by how they work with abundance is just completely flipped things on its head for me. That idea of the economy supporting scarcity, I don't just see it in terms of how we think about environmental issues, but even activism and urgency. When people talk about urgency and activism, people are told all the time, don't sleep, don't rest, don't take a break. This is far too urgent. It's a scarce resource, your activism. Rather than thinking about how we make change happen through taking ease and maybe doing less of certain things, we're constantly asking, how can we push more out of ourselves? And I think it comes from that same energy that you're describing. So to me, it was just such a reframing and such a complete breakthrough for that. So thank you for that. And then I just found there was a real interesting conversation around the field of sustainable consumption and how we talk about it. What we include in sustainable consumption. And in the last session I was just in, I was asked by Nicholas about framing sustainable consumption and whether we need to do a better job at a global level in defining it. And one of the things we realize is that the current definition circulating all the time does not nearly approach the richness of the conversation we're having here. And so it doesn't get at questions of what Noel's brought into his work in Calgary around affordability and blue-collar jobs and their link to the consumption space. It doesn't get at moving beyond the consumer society to well-being and redefining how we get our needs met, as Lauren said from Portland. Or Marilyn was talking about emotions and the way that those play into the whole sustainable consumption conversation. And I think that the challenge that I think I would be really interested in connecting with some of you about is helping at the global level to redefine the field so that we can get a richer focus on sustainable consumption in a way that relates to the kinds of conversations that are happening in this room.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's great. And now Manisha.
All right. Well, after those comments, I'll try to keep mine short because I think a lot of things were covered there. I want to kind of start by, I think in line with what Vanessa said, I think there's a great diversity of how sustainable consumption is understood in this room. And we talked at multiple scales, all the way from cities to national and federal policy, down to grassroots actions. We also talked in how sustainable consumption matters in different domains, from teaching to the household. So I think that richness was really exciting and interesting, and something that perhaps needs to be reflected more in the way in which sustainable consumption is defined in the literature. Yeah. I was very heartened to see that there was a more explicit focus on questions of power, politics, and ideology in, I think, this conference, from the panel that Lucy put together to Noel's talk about Calgary. That for me, and again, I'm sitting here as a person from India, from the global south, and for me coming into these conversations about sustainable consumption, that was really heartening to see. In terms of a challenge for research and implementation, I think I have 2 points. The first one being, I don't know how we're going to flourish in a world that is structured on the lines of racism, classism, patriarchy, and all those things. How do we flourish in a world that is marred by so much structural violence and oppression? And if sustainable consumption is about what being well, a good life is within ecological limits, then how do we as researchers working on sustainable consumption bring in those questions of structural oppression and power, and not just tack them on to our work, but put them front and center? So I think that is a challenge for our community. And then secondly, how do we decenter the sites of knowledge production on sustainable consumption? And I was really, excited to hear some of these words like participatory action research, community-based participatory research in some of the sessions I was at. We don't really know what sustainable consumption or what living in a sustainable community looks like, just us sitting in this room. We need to be having those conversations with communities all over the world and producing that knowledge and maybe taking that back up to UNEP and back to the UN. So I think in terms of implementation, how do we democratize our understanding of sustainable consumption would be the two kind of challenges I present to us as a community.
Thank you, Manisha, and thank you all three for being so articulate, and we of course knew whom we are going to invite. I would like to add one more point, that is that 99% of you were not able to participate in the session with 3 Brazilians remotely Skyping in. There are actually 5 people from Brazil and India who Skyped in. As you know, Brazil is in a big economic crisis. There's devaluation. People couldn't really afford to be here. But there were such great contributions, and one of them from Rita Afonso really struck me. She was talking about favelas and cultural experiments and building communities through cultural production, as she called it, in the favelas, in the marginal communities in Brazil. And it was so powerful, and she asked this question, does this belong to sustainable consumption? And this is very much along the lines that you also sketched. So I would like you to look at those videos. Andre Paz, another presenter, created great videos communicating sustainable consumption, sustainable lifestyles. So I want to thank our Brazilian participants who are not here for their great contribution.
Yeah.
By this, I open the floor for comments. Yes, please, Mari.
Hi, I'm Mari Marcus.
Sorry.
We're coming over with it.
Jess is coming.
We just want to capture all of your great words. Hi, I'm Mari. For those who don't know me, I'm Mari Marcus-Kainen from the University of Sussex, and even though I've been aware of SCORAI for a very long time, this was my first conference, and I really echo the feeling that it's been very warm and it's been very open and it's been brilliant and fantastic. And I think for me, one of the key issues that came up was actually from a session that I was chairing this afternoon, and it was about values, and this has been kind of ongoing throughout the presentations that I've seen, that the kind of values that we need in terms of sustainable consumption. And I know that we talked about that, okay, we have studied a lot of the poor nations and all the rest of it, and I think for us as a kind of community, this is something that I tend to be preaching quite a lot, but I think the change begins at home quite a lot, and I think SCORAI as a network should make all their future events vegetarian, and I think we should really think about that, that we are actually on the top very, very consuming people, and we are probably the one, whatever, 20% or something. And for instance, I do work on fuel poverty in the UK, and in fact, a lot of the people who live in fuel poverty actually live quite low carbon lifestyles because they have to. And I think that's something that we all can take home, and actually next time when we come to the SCORAI conference, hopefully it's all vegetarians or people who eat normally meat can see that actually some people can't afford to eat this, but actually it's good for the planet and we should take a note of that. So that's my take home.
Thanks. So I just wanted to say we shouldn't confuse affluence with inequality. So I have some evidence that high levels of inequality have lower carbon emissions. It depends where the inequality is and where the affluence is. So that it needs more research. I guess for me, I'm finding myself really, my activist side is getting more incited, if I could use that word. And I think in some ways we have enough knowledge to know that we have such a big challenge And I guess for me, it's back to power and income, and how do we reduce, it's almost, I don't want to repeat Bill Reese's, how do we have a planned recession, and how do we sell such a thing, or how do we frame such a thing so it doesn't sound like recession? I don't know, we need a whole nother, conference on creating a frame or a discourse, or, I mean, once we're constrained, we behave, if I have fuel poverty, if I'm a college student, if I don't have much money, I live a low carbon life, and I'm pretty resilient, I can be pretty happy with it, but I don't know exactly how to sell that. But I've really enjoyed my time here, and it helped me to look at my own research differently.
Maybe my most important take-home issue also came from a Skype session with only, I think, 5 people in the room and some on the other side of the internet. And I learned that now the #1 beef exporting country is the only country where cow slaughtering is not allowed, at least in most states, and that is India. And for me, this really symbolizes that while we are here talking and researching and doing it for 30 years, a lot of developments outside are still going in the other direction. And I think we have to always admit it without losing our confidence in a better future. I think this morning was really a nice talk, and I like some developments in Germany, but I can say, if you look at, for example, CO2 emissions and take into account that we now let produce our goods in Asia, at least a lot of that, we haven't succeeded anything in the last 30 years. We are a developing country when it comes to sustainable consumption. We have to admit that if we don't do it, we will not make progress. And if we admit it, we know what you say, that power and legal framework are really important topics here. And I hope that maybe at an additional or future conference, we might have more people like economists or so talking more about emission certificates, taxes, and all these topics, which politicians now, at least in Germany, do not dare to think about because they are difficult to communicate. But I think they are absolutely necessary to be tackled again.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Garrett Clark, and I'm with the United Nations Environment Program, and I'm the Program Officer on Sustainable Lifestyles and Education. And so my personal reflection is that usually I have to go to conferences all over the place and talk about like one particular element about sustainable lifestyles or sustainable consumption and production. And this has been a pleasure to be able to come and swim around people who are a lot smarter than I am and a lot more focused on what's going on. And it's just, for me, it's like a vacation because I don't have to go and try and justify my corner there. The kind of reflections I might have is that some of the comments that I hear about the values and meeting real needs versus perceived needs and this engagement of the individual into sustainable consumption and production, there's an opportunity now that the term sustainable lifestyles is on the global agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals, that right now there's a big push to try and figure out what that individual-based engagement is and how to work on it is there. And in the next 2 to 3 years, more is happening on that. And UNEP is part of that. And I think that that's where I see some of the direction happening. And I'd also note, as just a reflection to some of the last comments, is that there is a challenge we have when we're looking at changing production and consumption patterns, that the stakeholders don't have the private sector or the intermediaries who work with the private sector. Because when you look at development and how it's happening, which is money flows through value chains, etc., a big part of that engagement into this new paradigm has to involve the private sector, however that manifests itself, because goods and services that don't sell aren't going to go anywhere. And so one of the things that it's around terms like eco-innovation, or that has a lot of terms like co-creation, collaboration, which I've heard in different initiatives mentioned at city level or at individual activity level. It might be something interesting to think about for like keynotes or something, to see how we can pull in that other stakeholder group, even though I'm coming at it more from the perspective of more of an activist or a fonctionnaire. I still think it's part of the dialogue that needs to be part of where we're going. But again, I only offer those as a couple of comments, but in general, it's like, it's really a vacation to be here, so I'm really happy.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you for coming all the way from Paris to join us. Joachim.
So thank you for organizing the conference. What I found most positive was that in all the discussions about sustainable consumption and production, usually politics and power are the elephant in the living room. And here I found quite a lot of people which were standing there pointing all the time their fingers at the elephant. So maybe sooner or later he will be recognized and put to his right place. So that was a very positive step. Second element was in some workshops where we had reports from US case studies. That sounded so alien to me that nothing of that really had any meaning to a European. And then I was thinking about whether what I thought was not meaningful to a European from a German point of view might be from Italian, Spanish, British, or Scandinavian point of view not be even more different, and probably it is. So much of what we find cannot be generalized easily because the cultural conditions are so important in determining the results. On the other hand, I heard also some stories in one workshop which was brilliant, where phenomena were developing in one country which had developed in another country a decade earlier. And if we have an exchange about that, what these kinds of symptoms mean, what comes out of that, and what can be done against it, or for it, depending on what it is, we could accelerate and increase the efficiency of our work significantly. The only open question is, how do you organize that? And I give that as a kind of a homework to the conference organizers, the SCORI board, because you will have to think about what you do in the future. That is one suggestion, what you could do. Last thing which I was missing in the conference is, the question is, why do people consume and enjoy it? So what is the positive side of consumption? And combined with that, the question is, why do they specifically consume this stuff? Maybe some other stuff might satisfy their needs just as well. And that was then, I was reminded of a discussion we had where people said, well, consuming less or consuming things which are more durable or more sustainable shouldn't mean they are ugly. So there must be fun in consumption, because it has to do with fun and with aesthetics. And this is why the issue of design for sustainability, I think, should be an important element. How to make sustainable goods, or more sustainable goods, which are really meeting human needs, more attractive to consumers. And I think designers is a group which should be invited in these discussions. Maybe that's an idea for the next time.
Thank you. Very good points. Very interesting. Other observations, ideas, plans of action, or just reflections, or just tell us that you're feeling very unhappy here and want to go. If not,
No, hold on. I would like, before we close these proceedings, I would like Cindy Mori to come up. And we got some consumable, pleasure-producing tokens of gratitude to the two of you for incredibly hard work, amazing creativity. And Philip, come. It's for you.
you said Maury.
No, Mori to come here.
The way we're going to do this is this hasn't been choreographed. We're making this up as we all go. So just bear with us.
Okay, you give a speech, no?
Okay, no, you go first.
I thought it was for him.
I have, I've organized a thing or two in my life, but I found you so creative. Like, for example, we should adopt as a social practice having each keynote speaker having a designated chaperone, keeping track of them through the entire life cycle of the thinking of the conference until they are delivered somewhere there. I thought it was brilliant. I never thought of it. So, and I watched, of course, Philip and Cindy on the phone for a year and planning and sorting through the abstracts. Incredible amount of work. And the result is really wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
So just a caveat before I convey a couple of remarks. Our other kind of compatriot or co-conspirator in this whole conference and in SCORI in general is Emily Huddart Kennedy, who was forced to leave actually quite early in the day yesterday because of a change in air departures. So she should be standing up here, and if we even had a cardboard cutout, we would put Emily here. So anyway, so on behalf of Helena, myself, Emily, the entire SCORI board, we've been traveling together for the past 8 years. This is the second time that we've embarked on a event of this level of complexity and magnitude. Cindy and Philip have both done an extraordinary job. I'm grateful. I know the rest of the SCORI board is grateful. You've done a tremendous and thoroughly effective job. Your contribution to this community is unbounded. So thank you very much, Philip. And enjoy it.
My favorite.
So what are the arrangements for going to the Dirty Dog?